Como tinha dito, ainda temos algum tempo para questões, observações ou comentários que a audiência queira fazer ou colocar aos intervenientes no painel. Temos aqui uma pessoa, não sei se há mais, podemos se calhar selecionar 3 ou 4 questões.
Preferem que eu fale em inglês ou em português? É melhor. Good morning. Thank you for coming to our esteemed faculty. My question is for Professor Dan Sirek. Sorry, I don't know if I'm saying it correctly. And Sam Peters, and Dr. Sam Peters. Given the fact that Marine Le Pen might win the French elections next month, what's your perspectives on this agreement between the European Union and Canada if Marine Le Pen decides to leave the European Union? Thank you.
I have to give a macroeconomic answer. If France were to leave, if we had Brexit, well, that would of course diminish the value of the deal for Canada, and it would actually also diminish the value for the rest of the European Union. One of the things that these decades of integration within Europe have done is created supply chains across Europe, and so when a company that is sourcing from across Europe then wants to enter into a free trade agreement or to trade under a free trade agreement with a partner like Canada, it has to meet the rules of origin for the European Union. Now, as one country after another were to leave, then it would become more and more difficult for the remainder to actually for those companies that use French products, for example, in Portugal, then to meet the rules of origin for Canada. So it would throw a big monkey wrench into the workings of the trade system, and this issue will emerge with Brexit. Companies that have got supply chains across the channel that want to do business with Canada, the European Union will still have a free trade agreement with Canada. The UK will not upon exit. That's my understanding of the legal situation. So if you're counting on UK inputs as part of your originating content, it might not qualify for the CETA preferences. That's the way it would work, basically. So hopefully, of course, we will have a different outcome in France.
I think the question. But no, I mean, I can't really add on this. This is so hypothetical. I think we have to see also, you were mentioning Brexit. I mean, the question is then what comes in place. Also, you can only look at what the situation will be if you see what the trade deal is that is in place. And I think other than that, there's no predictions or suggestions, hypothetical thinking we can do on this.
Muito bem. Não sei se há mais questões, entretanto, estou mesmo Paulo.
Good morning. First of all, congratulations, Professor Cunha Rodrigues, for all the organization of this such an opportune event. Secondly, congratulations for all the presentations that we have today. My question is for both Professor Dan and Sam Peters, and I would like to listen to your opinion concerning the right to regulate. It is something that is very important to us. We see it as a conquer from all the procedure of the negotiations, and as you have both positions that are different. We would like to listen your arguments against and for the right to regulate. Thank you. As I understood, you have some problems concerning the right to regulate. You would like to see it more explained in the agreement, and I would like to understand a little bit more your position.
Very well. Okay, so that's straightforward. Okay, so the reason why governments regulate is because the market economy only takes into account the factors that are priced into the product. Okay, so you cannot put a tomato on your dining room table without generating all kinds of externalities, which are not in the price on the cost of tomato. Okay, so the transportation generates greenhouse gases. The farm use of fertilizers will generate runoff into the rivers and so forth. So if you put a regulation in, it's because you are taking into account something that the market does not. And that is normally a negative externality. It's a cost to the rest of society that is not being borne by the producer and by the consumer. So now you have a situation wherein there is a regulation that is implemented to address such a negative externality. Now the company, which has not been covering the cost of this negative externality, that's why the regulation is put in place, nonetheless has a right for profit expectation, right? Those profits were made without taking into account the cost to society that the negative externalities were generating, which the regulation then is put in place. So when you put this before an arbitration panel, the benefits to the company that are being foregone should be taken into account, but the cost to society of the negative externality should also be weighed in. This is my view. It's not a lawyer's view, it's an economist's view. Okay? And if you were to weigh those things in the balance, this is what I talked about the tail risk in the nuclear meltdown. When you net the cost against the benefit, then you get an award. Now, so if you have, for example, a situation wherein governments use something called eminent domain, which is, say, we expropriate a private sort of property because it's a greater public good. We pay the full cost for that expropriation. Okay, there's no net deduction. But if you are expropriating an activity by putting in place a regulation, that regulation has a negative impact which it is addressing, and that should be part of the ISDS calculation. This is what's missing in the ISDS framework. It does not take into account the substantive elements that the regulations are attempting to address. When you have to take into account negative externalities in regulation in order to have this mechanism really work well. Governments say that we have the right to regulate means that we have the right to address these negative externalities, but they're not specific on the point, and they don't explain that these costs should be netted out of any award.
Maybe to add to that, and I think it shows us in a sense that, of course, you look at it more from the evaluation, economic evaluation of the benefits and the cost, but because of all these concerns, and precisely because there's a worry, there was a concern that through the ESDS there would be a possibility for companies to tackle legislation which they felt was affecting their profits, their benefits. It has been very clearly stated in CETA, but also confirmed in the joint interpretative instrument which has been attached to CETA, that the governments have the right, preserve their right to regulate in all these issues, and that therefore, investment provisions will not be interpreted as meaning that the laws will remain unchanged. So governments can change their laws, and this is a protection in a sense that has been given, so to avoid that through the ESDS people would think they have a possibility to request modification of this law. So to be very clear, it's not because a company will have lost profit because of a measure of a government that this will be sufficient for them to say that the measure is inconsistent with CETA. This is not the case. Assurances have been given in CETA and in the joint interpretive instrument, particularly on this aspect. So.
Muito bem, creio que há ali mais uma questão.
Excuse me. First of all, I'd like to thank you very much for your presence, and my question will be to Mr. Sam Peters. I'm excited as well with the possibility to sign such a deal. However, I have a main concern from an environmental standpoint. Taking into account that Canada is more dependent on fossil fuels than the European average, can we expect a competitive advantage for our partners due to a different environmental standard? So basically, is environmental dumping a possibility? And if yes, is it a concern for the European Commission? Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. So, as I alluded to also in my earlier presentation, I think the important thing to remember here is that the rules we have, the protection we have on environment in the European Union, and Canada also has some legislation on environmental protection, by the way, is fully protected. This is not something which is, there's no commitments that have been made which would undermine the standards on the environment that we have in the European Union. So the current, one can be happy or not happy with the current legislation we have in the European Union. One can want more or certain, direction going in legislation, but this is an intra-EU process, a discussion which takes place also in the Parliament in Brussels and Strasbourg. But importantly is that through the trade agreement we have binding commitments on environment protection. We do not diminish the protections we have in the European Union. So in a sense, CETA is an agreement such as CETA poses no specific threat or danger to protecting these standards. And yes, for the European Commission, as you know, environmental protection is also an issue, and we also work on that. And it's in this context, specifically also linked to trade, that the Commission will actually launch, as I mentioned, this horizontal discussion on how can you, because that's the question, the concern and the debate is in Europe often in how can you enforce provisions on environment protection that you have in trade agreements. So there's different models that exist. This is something that will be discussed now at the horizontal level in Europe, and this will feed into how in the future we will then see our free trade agreements. And maybe lastly to mention, Canada and the EU have committed to respecting the Paris Agreement. Also it's not in CETA itself, but in the surrounding document. So I believe in this context we have all, between these partners, there's a lot of guarantees that have been given.
Firstly, thank you. Actually, the main question was that I'm aware that even though a product must respect EU norms when entering our market, therefore preserving our standards, what keeps a company from moving to Canada to take advantage of their less environmental friendly policy, for example? Because I think everybody knows that even though Canada is much more concerned about the environment than the United States, for example, I think their policy is less restrictive than the European one. So what keeps the companies from moving there to produce there instead of just keeping in the EU? Thank you.
Thank you. But I will leave it to my colleagues, to my Canadian colleagues, of course, to speak on the environmental protection in Canada. I think there is also a high level of protection over there. But the point is more, and this is broader than just on CETA, what you're asking is the question really for should you prevent a company, let me revert the question, should you prevent a European company to do business in another country? And how would a trade agreement be used to prevent them because you don't agree with the legislation in that country? It's true, CETA does not oblige Canada to change their legislation on environment, but that's the logical pendant to the fact that we do not want our trading partners to impose standards on us which would be lower than the European Union. What we can do is look at our market and look at how we can protect environment here. We have to make sure that all products that are made are living up to the standards of environment protection. The whole environment policy that you're referring to is not so much linked to necessarily trade agreements. I think it's about what position does the European Union take in agreements such as the Paris Agreement. How can we globally try to tackle environmental and climate change issues we have? And there I think the European Union is also taking a pro-environment position. But to say that you will solve this or to see as a negative that a trade agreement would not prevent you to invest in another country because you believe that there's a different standards of environment. I think this is probably asking too much from a trade agreement, but I look also at the other panelists if they have a more wiser view on this than maybe I have.
I guess the question you're addressing is that of environmental dumping, basically. And the question is, how prevalent is it? And it's not an issue between Europe and Canada in particular. I doubt that there would be any sort of environmental gap that could be exploited profitably by a company to switch its investment from Europe to Canada or vice versa. It's an issue with some countries where, again, you don't have the protection for the environment built into their own laws. So what, as Sam was saying, the trade agreements will require that you observe your own laws. They typically do not require you to implement new environmental laws. So there's a limited leverage that a trade agreement can have in enforcing extraterritorial application of environmental safety standards. The one thing which we can also say on this is that one of the great benefits of trading with Europe is the fact that Europe, as Europe became a wealthy economy, of course, it improved its standards. Europe used to trail the United States on standards, but somewhere in the 70s or 80s, it switched. Europe became the regulatory leader. Europe is the leading trade partner for something like 80 different countries in the world. And there's a California effect here. It's called the California effect, which is that the leading trade partner sets the standard, because if you set your production methods, you want to be able to sell to the European Union. And so it's a good thing for Canada to have Europe as a strong partner. It will enhance our standards. There are various areas, and the ambassador probably might not want me mentioning this, but we don't sell a lot of pork to the European Union. And the reason is because we allow the use of pork additives that are banned in the European Union, also banned in China, by the way. So two of the biggest pork consuming countries we don't sell pork to. We have harmonized with the United States on this, and we sell pork to Japan, Russia, and a bunch of others, but not to the European Union. It's called a beta agonist. It's one of 20 beta agonists. 19 are banned. We allow the one. I prefer, as myself, as I get wealthier, I become much more health conscious, and that's what's happening in Europe. So raising standards is very good. And this, of course, this is not so much on the environment issue, but the idea that trading with a country with high standards, including on the environmental, is a good thing. And so I'm glad for CETA on that regard. And I do not think there is an environmental dumping issue in the bilateral sense.
I would like to add just a small point. Also, in this case, there is a moral in the world. I mean, more requiring environmental standards does not avoid more efficiency. I remember about the planes, when the Airbus did come, it had much less consumption than the Boeing at that time, because having less pollution would mean to be more efficient, less consumption of fuel, of course. But again, coming to the numbers, it is good also to remember them. Europe has by far the highest standards in the world, together with Canada, I can say, but we have this surplus. Mr. Trump is suggesting not to have the same requirements. The United States has the biggest deficit of the world. The euro area, with the high, not only the social model, but the highest environmental standards, has a surplus of almost 400, at least a bit less, $1,000 million of surplus. The United States, with much lower standards, has the biggest deficit of the world with the dollar, so everything good, okay? They have the biggest deficit of the world with $440,000 million of deficit. So it is possible to prove, and it is very good for us Europeans to prove, that with the very required environmental standards, we can compete all over the world. And we should keep this good example, if you agree.
Muito bem, temos que encerrar este painel, que foi extremamente rico e interessante. Segue-se uma pequena interrupção para coffee break. Deixem-me só explicar que, saindo deste corredor, logo à saída do anfiteatro, do auditório, à direita há umas escadas, descem um piso e há um coffee break disponibilizado gratuitamente a todos os participantes. Nós vamos fazer uma interrupção de cerca de 15 minutos e retomávamos por volta de meio-dia, meio-dia e 5, agradecendo novamente a intervenção dos participantes. Thank you so much for being here.